Well, thanks for coming today. I'm excited about doing this program and just sort of thought of, hey, let's talk about what just happened. And the fact that on Easter Sunday, we're all enjoying and we see Pope Francis there. And the last person he talked to was Vice President Vance. And the next morning he woke up at Treasure and he had passed away and he had some health complications. And so this is obviously a concern for any Pope who is elected and mostly dies in office. So what happens when the Pope dies leading up to the events that will happen next week on electing the next Pope? So I thought it'd be cool. This is abbreviated from a lecture I give in the religion and politics course I teach, which we'll offer it next fall, by the way. So we'll have that as well. So we'll take some time, and then if anybody has any questions, Dr. Razor over here, Dr. Jill, she'll help with sort of the chat. And then for those that are on Zoom, if you have any questions, you could put them in the chat. And then when we get the question and answer time, we can respond to those. Okay. So what happens when the Pope dies? Okay, the clicker not.
It was just working.
It was just working. Hold on a second. So who is the Pope? This Pope has many titles. We say Pope, but this is a lot of titles. He's the Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ, Pontifex Maximus, successor of St. Peter, sovereign, Metropolitan Archbishop of Rome, Patriarch of the Latin Church. But another thing that's important is that he's also the sovereign head of state. So not only is the Pope a leader of 1.4 billion Catholics, he's a head of state, no different than the Queen of England or the President of the United States. And part of that has a lot to do with the Vatican. At one point had become the papal state, so it actually had become a territorial country, nation state, all the way up into the 1920s. Servant of the servants of God. So there's a lot of titles that the Pope has. If you've ever been to the Vatican, you can see a lot of Pontifex Maximus, the Supreme Pontiff, the Holy Father, a lot of these others that we use. The Pope is dead. So what goes on? And I don't know if some of you in the audience or on Zoom are Catholic or not. Anybody Catholic? Okay. There's obviously with the faith and spirituality, I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but there's some elements of the faith that are mysterious. But for the faithful, there's nothing more mysterious than the process that we're going to go through next week with the conclave. Things are locked away in a chapel, and you're not supposed to talk to anybody, and there's some mystery to that. And that's very intriguing. But popes, when they die, they enter this process called the conclave. Now, we've had a situation for the last pope before Francis who resigned. Benedict was older and not in the greatest of health, but he could have held on until his passing, but he decided to resign in early 2013. And there's a lot of intrigue of whether it was internal church politics, secrets, corruption, things that sort of never come to light. But when the Pope dies, there's a guy named Carmelado, the Chamberlain. He will determine that the Pope is dead, and then he'll destroy his pescatoria, the ring of the fishermen. And that's symbolic because this is the successor of St. Peter. Peter was a fisherman, and he was one of the 12 apostles who carried on Christ's message that on this rock you will build my church. And Peter is the English version of Petros, which is rock. And so when this Pope dies, all of his residents are vacated. Now, Francis did not stay in the splendidly luxurious papal apartments. He stayed in a room in the area where technically it's the hotel for where the cardinals are staying for the conclave. And they would say, sede vacante. So this Carmelingo is this person. It can mostly be a cardinal, it can be a priest, probably a priest cardinal, or anybody who is coordinating a lot of the affairs leading up to the funeral. And this is important because when the Pope is dead, there is nobody in charge of the Catholic Church. And we call this sort of an interregnum period, that between the moment the Pope dies and the election of a new Pope could be at a minimum 3 weeks. 2.5 at the quickest. It could be months, and it has been in the last of the papal church history. So in this interregnum, Pope Francis lied in state for 3 days in St. Peter's Basilica, and that is pretty much the epicenter of the Roman Catholic Church. And his funeral followed in St. Peter's Square, and Francis's was last Saturday. And so everybody came from all over the world, including our president and First Lady and everybody, to pay their respects to the late Pope Francis. He kept it simple. Francis was, if any of you followed him, he was one that he endeared himself to a lot of people, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, with a simple message that he lived the simple pastor life, just trying to be a servant of God. And he really shunned away from a lot of the trappings associated with the papacy. Because there's a lot of monarchical kind of tendencies to this, even though, there's other monarchies, I suppose if you study them, there probably is the nobles elected or something other, but this mirrors this in a way. He is not a king, but there's trappings associated with it that are very monarchical. And think of the names, Benedict XVI, John Paul II. That's how kings and queens are named. So Francis, being assumed this position, shunned a lot of that because he wanted to keep it simple. Another thing that's different is he's not buried in St. Peter's Basilica. So they're under St. Peter's, and the one that's there now, it's of itself 500 years old, but it's not the original. And so 15th, 16th century, they commissioned a new St. Peter's, and I think on doing so, unearthed crypts of possibly 100 popes. And I think it's believed that a lot of their bones and bodies may have been lost. So not every pope buried in St. Peter's, but there's a lot of them, and it's getting crowded. So predecessors are buried there, but he decided to be buried in another basilica in Rome called Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major. And he's the first pope to do so in over 100 years. So if any of you guys see did you see the funeral on Saturday? The procession, that's unprecedented. No one has ever seen a procession like that, or even seen on television through Rome like that for this. Last time they did it was 1903, if they ever did a procession at all, because the Pope wasn't buried. So that was unusual and very inspiring that he would be buried there. And because where the popes are buried in the crypt of St. Peter's, which is off to the public, this was a unique opportunity because the next day he was already interred. He was already in his tomb, and mourners and tourists, the faithful, went up to see it, which is unusual because I think if you went down to the crypt, it's a special tour and it's not really open to the public. But that in of itself was symbolic of Francis being a pope of the people, that he cared more about serving the poor, and then through his platform, trying to address the root causes of the things he pushed for: poverty, injustice, hunger, disease, famine, war, injustice. That's what he used to address, and to be that symbol of caring for those who are on the margins of society. And he's that symbol. So we have just supposed to exited the Novum Dialis, the 9 days of mourning. So I guess maybe some observers are like, okay, he's dead, pick a pope already. And it takes a little bit of time. Part of it is because of the Novum Dialis, and then just trying to figure out the next steps and being in a very respectful manner. I don't think anybody would object if election happened today. It wouldn't be seen as rushed, but perhaps maybe the perception is it could be. you know. But a lot of times we go into this, and the people who are in charge of doing this are the College of Cardinals. And part of why it's called a cardinal has nothing to do with a bird or liking the St. Louis Cardinals. They're clerics who are incardinated. It's sort of a term transferred into a new position. So most of these, like all of them, have been ordained to what they call the presbytery, ordained to the priesthood, or ordained to the episcopacy, which means they became bishops or archbishops. So they've been ordained. And likely becoming a cardinal, they were just incarnated and appointed. There are these, not to get too churchy technical, but there's these meetings that the College of Cardinals have called consistories, and they happen whenever the Pope feels like it, to appoint a set of new cardinals. So every once in a while, maybe not every year, but 20 new cardinals are appointed in this meeting called a consistory. And some of them who might be archbishops, become cardinals. And so their dioceses and archdioceses are led by bishops and archbishops, and not all of them are cardinals. But these men, many of them, there's 252 of them, have met 4 times. They met once after to set the date for the conclave. I think they've met 2 or 3 other times. So they've had a lot of meetings in this time, which is important in that having that window of 15 to 20 days to get rid of the conclave, because many of these men may not have met each other if they're all over the world. And the College of Cardinals is as broad in terms of geographic scope as it's ever been. So here's sort of a breakdown of these cardinals. 53 are from Europe. Now this is interesting telling, because this is an interesting statistic. Paul VI, who was Pope in the 1960s, was the first Pope ever to travel outside Europe. So the last couple of popes, that is a new phenomenon. So even around that time when Pope John Paul I was elected, and then the second, and Benedict, you had a lot more European cardinals than you do now. But based upon a papal encyclical in the 90s, University Domini Graecis, I think, the Pope John Paul II, set standards for the cardinals in the College of Cardinals in electing the next Pope. And you must be under the age of 80 to be eligible to vote in the conclave. Well, look at those numbers up there. The electors are those that are under the age of 80. The non-electors are still living cardinals over the age of 80. That's a lot of older cardinals. So I think the idea was to have it where if they're being elected among them, that there's at least some. I think one rationale could be if someone's 95, are they too old to be thinking about a decision? But also, if the cardinals are coming from the college to be the next pope, you don't want too old of a pope. So now, can someone of the 117 non-electors be elected? Yeah, but it's possible that you're going to only see them from the ones who are electors and who are electable. Okay? Now, this wasn't necessarily the way we picked popes. Prior to the 11th century, because if you think about it, you didn't leave Europe, and you didn't leave Italy, you didn't even leave Rome. So for being a universal church, there's probably parts of the world that didn't know what's going on in Rome. So it was Roman Italian centric. And so oftentimes popes were chosen because of acclamation from the local clergy or the faithful. A lot more of it had to maybe do with politics and inter-principality politics. Because oftentimes there were the families, very, very noble families, the Borgias and others who would ascend to the papacy. So it wasn't just, so you know, we kind of have a little bit of a different papacy in a sense. We have these priests who became bishops and archbishops and cardinals, and really part of the church, it was a little more, how much money did you have? How connected were you? to the other kings and queens and princesses that lived in Europe. So some of this may be familiar because when we take world civ in school and learn about Western civilization, a lot of it is the history of Christendom. The church dominated Western civilization up until the Protestant Reformation. So in the 11th century, yes, we didn't do this, and then Pope Nicholas II, 1059, established this college where three kinds of cardinals, either bishops, priests, and deacons, could participate. So initially it was just the cardinal bishops. And now there's three categories of cardinals, that you can be a cardinal priest, but not necessarily been ordained a bishop. You can be a cardinal deacon, and not necessarily, but likely the ones who are in the College of Cardinals today have been those who have many ways risen the ranks. Many of whom, if they aren't working in the Roman curia, the bureaucracy, they're an archbishop of a pretty big place. So about 100 years went by, and in 1268, if you ever were in talks of anything, I do talk about this. I don't try to do too much of it, focus on Catholicism and religion and politics class, but kind of lean on a little bit. It's sort of, okay, these are things that have happened throughout the history. But there was a period in 1268, and kind of those middle centuries were very schismatic, lots of divisions within the church. And 1268 was one where they couldn't agree on a pope. They couldn't do this job that seemed easy. And so they kept kicking the can, and there wasn't any resolution or decision on picking a pope. And everybody's growing tireless and restless. So they probably, at the time, the curia officials, because there was no pope, locked all these cardinals up in a room. It was in a room in the papal palace, threw away the key. But as I learned from my research, they removed the roof of the papal palace. I don't know what time of the year this was, but you're exposed to the elements, whether it's January or July in Rome. And if you've been to Rome, it can be downright hot and humid or cold. So that's sticking it to these cardinals. Make a decision. Oh, and on bread and water too. And you might sleep on the floor. So it took 3 years to get a new pope. And so the conclave tradition began. It's been reformed many times over, but to force a decision that you're going to make this decision. Now it's a lot more grown up and responsible. You know, we were doing this 800 plus, 750 plus years. So can you have deadlocks? Yeah, you can, but it's not going to take this long. And there's rules to preventing that anyway. So they set the date and the time. It occurs no less than 15 days or no more than 20 days after the death of the Pope. It was a little earlier because in the last conclave, because there was no funeral, because Benedict didn't die. So actually they elected him 13 days later, but it would still need time to get the cardinals to come to Rome. In fact, if they're already there for the funeral and these congregations, that's why I think there could be some members of camp to be, okay, you can start the election now. I mean, it's still going to be 6 days from now, and they've already been there for the funeral and all of that. But it took a longer time, so it was understandable back then when you had to get to Rome on horseback, or even in the late 19th, early 20th century by ship. It would still take some time. But here, since they're already here and air travels faster, you can get going. And that's important because of all the cardinals that are coming from all these other parts of the world. That may not have been the case even before. So in this whole process, there's lots of politicking and jockeying among the cardinals. They may be considered for election, and they call this group the Papabili, the Papabili. And no, the Papabili are not campaigning like this. I got this from The Onion about 25 years ago. So no, they're not going out kissing babies and going, yeah, VT for Pope. No, it doesn't work that way. I'm glad I'm in the fight. This cracked me up. But no, they're not doing the politicking that politicians do, because they're not politicians. But are they political animals? You've taken 102. We talk about this as sort of the nature of kind of politics, that people, men, human beings are political animals, so on politicon. So men who are leading the highest levels of the clergy are very astute politically in terms of understanding how the politics work within the church organization. So among these cardinals, there aren't political parties per se. And so a lot of this was gathered from research from John Allen, who was a writer for the National Catholic Reporter, and then Thomas Rees, who is a Jesuit, who actually wrote a nice book about inside the Vatican, who actually incidentally has a PhD. He's a Jesuit priest with all that Jesuit training, but has a PhD in political science from Berkeley. So two big sources on understanding church politics. But a lot of their research and others is there's these unspoken political parties. And they are delineating among the left and right. And it's looking at the church in sort of several angles, both internally and externally. So what is the church doing within the four walls, and what is it doing externally outside the four walls in its ministry? And so it depends on where you fall. So liberals internally have been sort of identified as reformers. They're more ecumenical, meaning being open to having dialogue and relationships with other faiths. So interfaith understanding, ecumenism. Decentralized, open and diverse, reforming the Roman Curia. That's important to liberal reformers. You probably put Pope Francis in there for him to be articulating, who am I to judge what your sexual orientation is? Who am I to judge that? There's a place for you. It was quite a profound statement, but it would fall in line with this part of the political calculation and political framework of what they want the church to be, or what these clergy and cardinals want to be. Whereas the conservatives, John Allen referred to this as the border patrol. So these are the ones who fight against society's isms, secularism, radicalism, relativism, multiculturalism. These are folks that kind of, in fact, there's our last Pope, Benedict XVI, Pope Francis, would have been considered a border patrol. He, Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger was his name, who became Benedict XVI. And Benedict was, he had this office when he was cardinal called the Prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. One of the more significant ones in this bureaucracy that essentially says, okay, are we going to follow church teaching and dogma? He was often referred to in the press as God's Rottweiler. So the church is going to do this. We're going to stick to our guns, and this is what the church is going to be, no ifs, ands, or buts. So you see kind of the distinction among the church of those that are open. Hey, there's a place for you. Even if there wasn't a place for you before, versus no. We want a church that's faithful, adheres to traditions, and almost even a smaller faith. So they're not concerned about bringing people in. They're more concerned about, okay, if you're in, are you going to follow doctrines, strict doctrines of the church, the traditions? They want a smaller, more faithful mass. They want to return to the Latin mass. And why that's important is that there was this council called the Second Vatican Council in the 60s. And the part of the reform was bringing the church into the modern world. Prior to that, the church is very, what we call anachronistic in a way, that a lot of the church politics and probably pulse in the world was very, very old school, very antiquated. And even if it feels like the church is still a couple steps behind the modern world, everyday world, it was much worse back then. And so the Pope at the time called an ecumenical council, John the 23rd, to bring us up, sort of dealing with modern realities. And one of those is having mass in the language that you speak. There are traditional conservatives who think that that was madness. What on earth are we doing mass in Portuguese? You almost want to be, are you Portuguese? Yes, I'm Portuguese, but it's the tradition, the Latin mass. And so there's conservatives who are, the church lost their way the day they decided to go to the language of their of where they are. But that's a great simple. If I'm Catholic in Portugal or in Brazil, what if I'm uneducated on the Latin? It's bringing to them, and had an enormous impact on enlarging the faith, maybe almost unintentionally. Probably I wasn't there, but I'm sure the Second Vatican wasn't thinking about, oh wow, look at the uneducated masses will be positively impacted by having the mass in their own language. Then you've got others that are more looking at it externally, where the liberals have this social justice mindset. What can we do to address the root causes of a number of social problems? Not only address them, but solve the root causes of all these things. So social justice, Catholic social teaching is about what are we doing to believe in the dignity of the human person? What are we doing with what they call preferential option for the poor? What are we doing to address these problems and issues? How are we serving the poor? But then there's others that they call, this John Allen calls integralists, conservatives, where they believe that civil society and government should mirror what the church says. So church values should guide government policies. And that's not an unusual approach for other countries in Europe and others, that a lot of what you see is mirrored and it tends to kind of be on theocratic terms, where policies of the state and policies of the church are intertwined. Well, that's not the case here in the US of A, because our Constitution has separation of church and state. But that hasn't stopped a lot of American Catholic conservatives from wanting to follow this. So there probably are some bishops and prelates who follow this integralist view, who would like to see, hey, let's follow the faith a little bit more towards the government, or the faith informs and frames public policies and government action. Now, Americans, a lot of us look at that, we're uncomfortable. But you've seen it, maybe not in the Catholic realm, but we saw it with George W. Bush. A lot of more, I would say, conservative administrations, the Republican administrations would probably fall a little more into this, despite what the Constitution says. And even those folks in our conservative side are not violating the Constitution, it's important to sort of note, compared to other societies where there is an integrated and very little distance between church and state. We do have enough distance here. Maybe it doesn't feel that way at times, but we do. But it's still something that conservative bishops in the United States want to push. Now, the conclave here, there's this saying, based upon this politicking and wanting to be kind of, okay, am I the right person, this or that? There's a saying that, hey, those who want to enter the conclave of Pope come out of cardinal. So in other words, if you're campaigning for Pope, if you're going in, if you're doing what they've been doing for these congregation meetings the last week and a half, yeah, I want to be Pope, I really do. There's a good chance you'll come out not being Pope. So there's this fine line. And sometimes I guess our politicians do it. You want it, but you don't want it that bad. You're ambitious, but not too ambitious. You know, I think politicians kind of play that a bit, probably at any level, but the church probably a little more, have to be a little more discreet, a little more. And I think a lot of this has to do with also factions and parties vouching for you on your behalf. Did anyone see the movie Conclave that came out? There's some of that at play, where, you know, the Stanley Tucci character sort of wasn't sure he wanted it, but people were vouching for him. So that's kind of probably more what happens. But if you're campaigning, you know, glad handing the college, I think that's unseemly, at least in terms of how Church and Vatican observers. But you still have to sell, you know, it's sort of that fine line. Now, these papabili, this is a list of folks who, and papabili, and I was blocked up there, these are the men who are thought of to be serious contenders or have a serious chance of becoming the next pope. This term is papabili, or papabili, plural. And it's just a list of folks that are kind of on this list. Some of them, and I'll go through some of these. Some of these are bishops of dioceses and archdioceses. Some of them, they have these long titles. It's because they're leading an office. Sometimes these offices are called dicasteries in the Vatican. And these offices are in the Roman Curia, which is the Vatican bureaucracy. But some of them, there's a few that are American. There's one, I kid you not, Cardinal Pizzaballa. Pier Battista Pizzaballa. Imagine if he were elected. Would he take the name John? That would be funny. Because then it'd be Papa John. I don't think what's ironic is I bet they've never heard of Papa John's Pizza. And that's probably a good thing. But some of these, if you look at some of these folks, they lead large. If they are a bishop or if they are an archbishop, it's the larger Catholic centers. So one of them is Louis Tagle. He's I think he was the former bishop of Manila. Manila, the Philippines, is a mega city. And so these are just sort of lists of folks who, whether they, and some of them have been retired, but they're still kind of considered in that. And some of these names are going to stand out. But they're from these offices, they're from around the world. So real quickly, what I want to do is I want to show a website. That it might be of interest to you. And it's the College of Cardinals report. And so if you want to go on this, there are 20 cardinals that are in this mix that are considered the papabile. And it gives even more information that's on there of where they're from, who they were appointed by, nation they're from, and whether they serve a diocese, archdiocese, or whether they have an office within the Vatican, the Roman Curia. So Curial would be one of those. So that's kind of everything they're going to have to look at as well. Okay, so I'll go back to the. So it's College of Cardinals report. Okay, so a lot of these are folks that are going to be in the mix. That could be potentially the next pope. And you've got to be under the age of 80 to participate, just to repeat it myself. Okay. So what happens? The conclave is going to begin next Wednesday. They're going to have a mass in the morning, and then they're all going to process into the Sistine Chapel. So if any of you have ever been to Rome in the Sistine Chapel, and you've got God's finger, you got the images of Michelangelo staring down on these cardinals. They will do one vote, first round of voting in the first evening, and they take an oath every day to affirm the office of Peter, pastor of Universal Church, and they lock the door to outsiders. And either the Carmelite, maybe not the Carmelingo, but with the protodeacon or the head of the cardinals will say, extra omnes, which is Latin for get out, for all of you who don't belong. And they'll do this. And actually, I think in 2013, they did a good job of kind of televising as much as they could before. So with CNN or NBC, they did it in 05 too. So at least this will probably be the third. I don't know if in the 70s we had the kind of live TV to do that, but at least I've seen it at least I think twice where you're as much as you can get before they close the door. So they're shorter, as I said earlier, some for 4 days, but a lot of them have been for months. But during the conclave, it's not, and I guess even up until recently, it might have been more of a Spartan existence, where I think there's even early 20th century conclaves where they were sleeping on floors and stairwells and this or that, but not for the cardinals and prelates of today. So they have, my understanding is that next to the papal palace are just large dorms that are meant to accommodate the college during this time. My understanding is when they're not used, there's just a lot of cool open apartments that people can stay guests of the church. But they're spacious and proper, and they're even allowed to have assistants if some have health problems. So even some of them they're allowed to have assistants, nurses, and so it's these. I guess with some of these, if you're princes of the church, as the cardinals are called, and you live in comfort, it's accommodated even during this process. Because I don't know, you want any a prelate to die because they were denied food or water. And who knows with the church history, who knows how many people died in the conclaves that they talked of it before. I couldn't gather any information of any of that either, you know. So what does the conclave do? They use this, what they call method of scrutiny. Here's how the scrutiny works. So for each day, 3 scrutiners are chosen by lot among the 135. And so each of them come to a table. And then the least senior cardinal in the whole college will draw 3 more names to collect ballots. So they're going to be the ones that, yeah, if you're too sick to get up every time, there will be somebody who facilitates. So you have 3 that will scrutinize at a table and the 3 that will kind of facilitate. So, and then they even have 3 names or revisers to review the work of the scrutiners. So you've got 6 people looking at each vote. So each ballot, when the cardinal comes to ballot, it has this information. It has Iligo in sumum pontificem. So I elect the supreme pontiff, and you get the name. But each time, and this is why it's got to be swift, each of these cardinals are doing a small little prayer. Place their ballot into a chalice and say this prayer. I call as my witness Christ the Lord, who will be my judge, that my vote is given to the one whom before God I think should be elected. And that's the English translation. They're saying it in Latin. So you're hearing all this for every cardinal who goes up to vote, even the ones that are facilitated. So that's why these rounds can take a while. And the more you have, the more, okay, we know Cardinal so-and-so wants to vote for him. We got it, okay. But this is just the way they've been doing it through tradition. So after these 3 scrutineers read it, after having them double checked by the revisers, they pierce the ballots with a needle and they tie all the ballots into a receptacle. And they put this in the receptacles and they're burned with a chemical. And the chemical, obviously, they put it in a burn, could either produce black smoke or white smoke. Black is inconclusive. White means we have a vote. And they'll say, Habemus Papum, but they'll know by seeing the white smoke. Now that's tradition. Is it possible that somebody could have a cell phone and hear deliberations? Yeah, I mean, as much security as there's technology. But for the most part, if it's done properly, you'll know when the smoke clears. And so, yeah, we've heard that term. You probably heard that. We'll see. When will we know? We'll see it from, white smoke from the stacks. That kind of comes from this. So the only thing that remains is a document that the scrutiners and the revisers put down as the votes. And even that's secret. So there is no paper ballots that remain after each round. So there's 4 rounds each day, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. There will be only 1 on the first day, just because it's sort of tradition. So you'll never know. And usually in the first day, the first round, you never elect. So we'll go into the second and third day. Or most likely on May 9th, we will have a new vote. And it'll be remembered throughout history that May 9th, 2025, or whatever they would say that in Latin, would be the election of whoever. But they need 2/3 of the 135 to be elected. That is a high bar. Not as high as getting elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame, which of course is kidding. But 2/3 is. Actually, there have been people who joked about, my gosh, you get elected Pope better than getting in the Hall of Fame. But 2/3 is the bar. And the 135 has changed. My understanding is I think it was 115 at Francis's election and 115 at Benedict XVI. The college has gotten larger in part because the popes have decided to elevate more cardinals, appoint more cardinals. It also says a lot about the evangelization of the growth of the church around the world as well. So in any respect, that's not a bad problem to have, but it's more. So voting will proceed through all these things. So if they do the 4 rounds of voting, they'll do 4 rounds for 3 full days. So including the first ballot the first night. So you could go essentially 13 ballots, but if no one's been elected at the last ballot on the 3rd full day, they'll suspend for 1 day for prayer and reflection. Now that could also mean more behind the scenes bartering, politicking, or whatever. But more of this is meant to be reflective, and then they'll do 7 more votes, a pause, and 7 more votes. So if this thing does linger, they do have a place, and this was put in that University Domenico Gregi's 1996 encyclical, that if it goes this long, think about the days, 7 more ballots is another 3.5. 7 more votes are potentially 2 more days each. This lingers, then if no one's elected, it's just an absolute majority at that point. But it hasn't gotten to that under the new papal rules, which have only been around since 96, so this is only the 3rd conclave. Once the cardinal receives the 2/3 vote, the dean of the College of Cardinals will come and say, do you elect to accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff in Latin, of course. Now, there have been some popes or cardinals who, not sure, usually they would say accepto, but in the chance that sometimes it doesn't happen, no one knows if they've been talked into it even more. I think there's probably been some stories of someone rejecting, we don't know. But at that point, usually when they say accept, they'll ask what the new pope's name will be. Now, this is a very overwhelming time. This is holy cow. My life has changed. Think about how much your life's changed. Francis becomes pope, and Francis, his name was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. I should have mentioned this. He was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Okay? The man was elected March 13th of 2013 to become pope. He never went home again. So your life has changed forever. Now, could he have us a papal visit? He didn't, and it was interesting why he didn't do that. I'm thinking about that. Maybe that was an act of purpose or something that, but your life is never going to be the same. You are not going home. You are the leader of the church. So it's what has to be an overwhelming feeling for any of these men to be taking over the Catholic Church at that particular moment in time. So they do have an area, I think, outside the balcony. They call it, I think, the Room of Tears, which is supposed to be maybe that's where the Pope collects his thoughts, and it's just a very kind of, because they're not waiting that long. So I'm trying to remember the last one. It might still be an hour, from the time you get the white smoke until you get the procession out. Because nobody knows. Even if you down the way to kind of hear, oh, I heard that, and you see the white smoke, nobody knows. And so the procession kind of comes where there will be these other acolytes, servers, other bishops that will walk in front of the new pope. And the pope is given this elaborate stole cassock, because they wear it all the time, that will tell you who it is. But before that happens, you get the senior cardinal who says, Habemus Papum, we have a pope. And the pope will emerge right after that with a blessing and a short speech. And for some who have borne witness to it, it's one of the most memorable experiences of life. And to see this happen in their very eyes. So a couple days after the election, so yeah, these cardinals are still sticking around. They'll have an inauguration or installation mass, where historically the Pope received a tiara. Now they receive the fisherman's ring. The previous conclaves, this is how it went down. So even some of them before these rules were relatively quick. Paul VI was difficult because it may have had a lot to do, my guess is, with the Second Vatican Council. So everybody was already in Rome with a bunch of meetings, and so John Paul XXIII died during that. So it might have been a mix of the council and the meetings happening and then the conclave. So it's probably why that took a while, even though the ballots. And I got this from the John Allen book. Now, this is interesting if people don't know this part. There's two. I guess the question would be, why are there two in 1978? John Paul I was an Italian, had been elected, and he died 33 days later. Think about being a cardinal, where you're there at the death of Paul VI, Novum Dialis, that 9-day mourning period, the 15 days. He's elected, you coronate him. And what if you're an archbishop going back to Seoul, South Korea, or Sydney, Australia, or New York? And a month later, you got to go around and go to another. So that was sad. He died of a heart attack. Of John Paul I. And so there have been conspiracy theorists out there who believe that there's been injury, there's something might have been amiss in his passing, and people have they investigated that, and there was enough that they did investigate his death, and there wasn't foul play or any kind of side wishing that, it never got to the scrutiny of the JFK assassination. Right. But that's a lot of thinking about. You're a cardinal. It's like, wow, I spent all this time just doing conclave stuff. But when Pope John Paul II was elected, he was the first non-Italian pope in 456 years, since Adrian VI during the Reformation. But every pontiff up until then had been Italian. The last three have not been, which is very interesting. Tim, the former Cardinal Wojtyla, who was the Archbishop of Krakow, Poland. His successor, the former Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger of Germany. And then his successor, the former Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio of Buenos Aires. Who will it be? These were relatively short compared to others. So who's going to be this next pope? Is it an African pope? Saw the thing back there of all the different the amounts. Let me see if I can get that information again. Only 53 of the 135 are from Europe. And actually of Europe, that's not all dominated by Italian. So could it be an African pope? There's 18 electors from the continent of Africa. And these are some of the ones that are on the Cardinal Sarah. He's from Guinea. Cardinal Turkson's from the Republic of Ghana. Cardinal Bensuku is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Could it be an Asian pope? Cardinal Tagle, Cardinal David, Cardinal Avincula. Another one of those. Could it pay back to an Italian? The three haven't been. And Cardinal Parolin, who's the Vatican Secretary of State. Cardinal Zuppi, who is, I think, the Archbishop of Bologna. Could it be an Italian again? Could it be a member of the Curia? Somebody who is an insider in Vatican politics, in the bureaucracy. Could it be? Because all these men who are meeting, including the 10 American cardinals, if you're a cardinal, I think most of them are archbishops. So Timothy Dolan is perhaps one of the more visible ones in America. He's the Archbishop of New York. He's not in Rome. So he doesn't know what some of these other cardinals and prelates know about the inner workings of the church. Because in addition to being a shepherd, being the successor of St. Peter, you have to oversee a bureaucracy that governs the church and all of the archdiocese and dioceses and all of the offices associated with it. Yeah, we could have a whole course just on, Vatican politics. I have nothing to do with this. Could it be another European? There's this one called Cardinal Erdo, who's Hungarian, the Archbishop of Budapest. And that's an interesting one because we're seeing right now, talk about the convergence of politics and church, that there's a very strong arm president in Hungary that is seen as an inspiration to our current president right now. That Trump looks up to the president of Hungary as sort of a model of governing. But this Cardinal Erdo is very conservative. The Cardinal Ike, I think, is from the Netherlands. You have some conservative bishops. So would the College of Cardinals go conservative? Based on what I said earlier, we're tired of this, you know, and who knows what kind of language they've been using, you know, amongst the stuff. We're tired of this openness and this free spirit of Francis, you know. We want to go back to a conservative orientation based on the traditions of the church. What about a dark horse long shot? Could it be an American? Likely no, and here's why, is that throughout the church's history, the major superpower, a cardinal from the major superpower has never been elected politics. So who's the major superpower? Still for the most part, still the United States. They haven't been kicked off that. So likely in church politics, you're gonna pick an American, probably a long shot. Even though there's some, like Cardinal Prevost, that thinks internally, I think he's one of those Vatican officials, could have some inside. Tobin is the name, he's the Archbishop of Newark, who actually was the Archbishop of Indianapolis. So wow, that would hit. But Dolan is seen as somebody who could fit that image of John Paul II and even Francis. Very gregarious, outgoing. You ever go to St. Pat's in New York? He would preside over mass as the Archbishop of New York. He's on the Today Show. He can just walk down the street. He's on the Today Show. If they ever want. In fact, after Francis died, he was on the Today Show talking about all this. So it's impossible. But no, historically, you have not seen a cardinal come from a major world power. That could be why it went 450 years with Italian. We don't want somebody who might be manipulated by the Spanish monarch, you know, or that time, or a Brit, whoever was those, think about your world history, who was sort of the major political center at the time. And so the United States, at least in the 20th and 21st century, is probably not that, but it could possibly. Any questions? I'm finished. Let's see if we had some. Were we able to see anybody typed in? Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, but I'm not, you know, 13th century, you know, if you went back a time machine to that, you would die because of the stench probably at that moment in time compared to our health and hygiene. In fact, you probably go to New York in 1900 and have the same thing. So it was what it was. I'm sure, you know, I just read that somewhere, probably into the details. I'm sure it was hell. Sort of the worst existence you can imagine. Where are you going to eat? You know, if it's bread and water, where are you going? And heck, a lot of these conclaves up until, what's the biggest game changer in society? Political king, debts. That doesn't even got topic here. In times probably prior to the 20th century, the only ones who probably lived in somewhat comfort were kings and nobles. Now, who knows if even they did? If cardinals were having to be locked up and doing all, you know, we got it made the 21st century in a way compared to, we got some.
Oh, gracious, sorry. Yeah, we have a question here. Are the results of each vote shared with the conclave?
Yes, the breakdown in terms of my understanding is that at the end of the round, it'll be counted by the scrutineers. 65 for Cardinal Conclave, 62 per cardinal, and so on and so forth. But no, they do not know each individual's votes. They're given that as sort of secret when they get the ballot. Did that answer that, Greg? Their microphones are on. Okay. Any other questions? No, good question up there too. Yeah, I think those prelates and cardinals aren't going to stand for anything less than splendid comfort, even during a conclave. Yeah. But that was sending a message. The church is not a vote. Yes, on. Thank you. That's a possibility. Should have mentioned this earlier, that of the 130, I may have, but if I'll repeat it again, of the 135 electors, 108 were appointed by Francis. So that's a lot. Now, are there more of the breakdown? Actually, that list will give you, if you go to that website, I did click on the capability, but I think it gives a list of every cardinal and their affiliation. So in fact, there's 117 non-electors. So that's possible. It's possible just because you were appointed by Francis doesn't mean that you are 100% mirroring his church politics. I think it's likely that maybe you'll have a pope that could be in that vein. But it's not guaranteed. You had conservatives who voted for Cardinal Bergoglio. I don't think the previous colleges, to answer your question, were as liberal as they are now. And it produces Francis. Francis actually, we know this, that he was actually second in the 2005 conclave. So there must have been among those votes quite a distinction. Where is this church going? And some of these votes are symbolic. It's not just voting a man who's going to be pope. Where are we taking this church to in terms of not only its spiritual direction, but its temporal? What are we going to do in terms of solving the world's problems? And so could it be a reaction to that? I think another answer to that, Dr. Armato, is you see in these countries and all these populist movements that are moving away from governments that represent different and other. And if you're very nationalistic, you're very insular. You know, Brexit, we don't want an engagement with the rest of the European continent, Great Britain. If you're like that, you're not going to represent or embrace positions that are inclusive. So it's probably not going to see a hardline conservative because he has to sway over a lot of votes, but it could be somebody who's not as liberal as Francis. But it depends. Yeah, just because you stack the deck doesn't make it so. But on the other hand, that's a lot of appointees in 12 years. And some of them may have actually died or gone up past age 80. When he has these consistories and he's appointing 20 cardinals at a time, that's a lot. That's a statement saying, hey, I'm influencing the next conflict. But nothing's automatic. Did I answer that okay? Yeah, because could it be, you know, I'm not sure, you never know. Because there could be arguments being made, not only arguments in the, maybe not the conclave, but certainly these general congregation meetings or things on the sidelines that are, hey, some problems here. The church is in a unique position. Some of our observers argue in some ways it's comes at a worse time because of where the world is and political movements afoot that are a lot more reactionary. Will the politics of the country influence the politics of the conclave to push the church more right? It's possible. And that would undo a lot of the stuff that had been happening. Okay. When did the role of the papacy evolve from a spiritual authority to a significant political force? think through a lot of, if you answer this, Jordan, a lot of the history of Europe is the history of Christendom. And so as the church grew, it became a power that in many ways held primacy over the kings and empires of Europe. So throughout history, I think there was a coronation, I think of, I'm fuzzy on the history, but there was one where one of the French kings took the crown from the Pope's hands and put it on his head. You know about this part, Dr. Erder? But it was a little bit earlier than that, but the point being is that there have been all this back and forth of primacy of the church versus the states and the kingdom. And it emerged, I think there was a little bit of a decline as we got towards the towards Renaissance, and of course with the splitting of the church, the authority was a lot more compromised. But the rise of the papal states in the 19th century allowed the church to be a powerful geopolitical force again. So it's, if Jordan answered your question, it's had some fits and starts, some primacy over kingdoms in the Middle Ages, declined and went back up again. But it has a significant force, political force, certainly from a symbolic standpoint, not a territorial one. So the Swiss Guard is not an army like the US or Chinese army. But the Pope's words matter and can influence political affairs everywhere. Did I answer that, Jordan? Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Okay, well, thanks for coming. This was fun. This was fun. This is good to talk about this, and hopefully you watch it and see the white smoke and welcome in a new pope.